You're sitting in the cracked vinyl chair at Gus's auto shop on a Thursday morning, waiting on a routine oil change for your 2013 Honda Accord, the same car you bought used 9 years ago with 61,000 miles already on it. The waiting room smells like motor oil and the burnt coffee sitting in a machine nobody's cleaned in a while. A small television mounted in the corner playing a morning talk show with the sound turned almost all the way down. A younger guy across the waiting room, dropping off a car of his own, glances at your Accord through the window, the faded paint on the hood, the small dent near the rear bumper you've never bothered fixing, and says, not unkindly, "Man, that thing's earned its retirement. You should treat yourself to something new." You smile and say maybe someday, the same thing you've said for at least 4 years now. You don't tell him that your combined investment and retirement accounts crossed $2.1 million 8 months ago. You don't tell him about the rental duplex 2 towns over that's been cash flowing steadily for 11 years, or the fact that you could pay cash for any car on the lot across the street without touching a single other account. You just wait for Gus to finish the oil change, pay the same $43 you've paid every few months for over a decade, and drive the Accord home. Here's the part almost nobody understands about the way real wealth actually gets built by ordinary people with ordinary jobs. It doesn't announce itself, and it definitely doesn't require a nicer car to prove it happened. You've looked exactly the same amount of getting by for over a decade now, and the gap between what people assume looking at that Accord and what's actually sitting in your accounts has only gotten wider with every year you kept driving it. You bought the Accord at 34, paying $11,400 in cash for a car with 61,000 miles on it, financed by nothing but the balance of an old savings account you'd been building since your first job as an occupational therapist. You remember the specific satisfaction of that purchase, not the car itself, which was perfectly ordinary, but the fact that you'd never have to think about a monthly payment again, an absence that turned out to matter far more than you expected at the time. You remember signing the paperwork at the small used car lot, the salesman, visibly a little surprised you weren't interested in financing, mentioning almost reflexively that they had great rates available before you told him, plainly, that you'd rather just pay it off entirely. Your coworker Wade, who started at the same clinic around the same year, leased a new Nissan Altima that same spring. $340 a month, nothing down. Replaced twice more in the years since with newer models each time. You never judged Wade for it. You understood the pull of wanting something to point to, especially in a job that pays steadily but never dramatically, the kind of job where a nicer car can feel like the only visible proof that the years are actually adding up to something. You kept the Accord instead, through a transmission repair at year 6, a new set of tires at year 8, and a check engine light at year 11 that turned out to be nothing more than a loose gas cap. An anticlimax you remember laughing about with Gus for a solid 5 minutes in his shop. Both of you genuinely tickled that a $200 diagnostic fee had been avoided by simply tightening a cap by hand. Gus mentioned that same visit that he sees plenty of customers trade in cars with problems far less serious than a loose gas cap, spooked into a new purchase by a warning light they never bothered to actually diagnose first. Currently, the average new car payment sits above $730 a month, and the average length of a car loan has stretched past 6 years for a meaningful share of new buyers. Numbers that would have added up, across your own working life, to well over $80,000 in payments for cars that were worth less every single month you drove them. You put that same money somewhere else entirely, and the difference between those two paths, repeated for over a decade, turned out to matter more than almost any single investment decision you ever made on purpose. You've done the actual comparison more than once over the years, mostly out of curiosity, rather than any need to justify the decision to yourself. If you'd financed a new car every 6 years instead, the way a meaningful share of your coworkers have, the total cost across your working life would have run somewhere in the neighborhood of $95,000 once interest and depreciation are accounted for honestly, money that, redirected into the same index fund your Roth IRA has used the whole time, would represent a genuinely significant additional slice of your current net worth, quietly missing entirely because it went toward a sequence of cars instead. You started as an occupational therapist at 26, making $54,000 a year at a hospital rehab unit, and opened a Roth IRA that same year with $50, an amount so small it felt almost embarrassing to bother with. You set up an automatic transfer of $180 a month, timed for 2 days after each paycheck, into a low-cost index fund. You didn't pick individual stocks. You didn't try to time the market. You just let the transfer run, mostly forgetting about it in the long gaps between checking. Every time you got a raise over the following years, you raised the contribution the same week, before the higher number in your checking account ever had the chance to feel normal. By year 8, your salary had grown to $71,000, and your monthly contribution had grown right alongside it to $420. You remember a specific year, year 11, when the account first crossed $100,000, a milestone that felt, at the time, both enormous and strangely undramatic, discovered while paying bills at your kitchen table on an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening, the number sitting quietly at the bottom of a screen you'd almost closed without checking that particular account at all. There were rough years mixed in, the way there always are. A market downturn in year 15 knocked the combined accounts back by nearly $80,000 over 6 weeks, a number that would have genuinely alarmed you a decade earlier. You didn't sell anything. You kept the automatic transfer running the entire time, mostly because you'd read enough by then to expect exactly this kind of stretch eventually, and you'd already decided in calmer months what you'd do when it happened, which was nothing, deliberately, no matter how loud the instinct to check the account every single day became. At year 13, you bought a small duplex 2 towns over, using savings you'd built separately from the retirement accounts, moving into one unit and renting the other to a reliable tenant who stayed for 6 years running. The duplex has never been glamorous. A $920 mortgage payment, a tenant's rent covering most of it, occasional repairs that eat into the margin some months more than others, including a $2,400 roof patch in year 4 that ate an entire year's worth of the unit's net profit in one afternoon. But it's added a second, quiet stream of equity and income that's run in parallel with the retirement accounts for over a decade now, mostly without you thinking about it, much beyond the occasional maintenance call. Your tenant, a soft-spoken nurse named Delphine, has renewed her lease 5 times now without a single late payment, and you've kept her rent increases modest and predictable each time, mostly because losing a reliable tenant and searching for a new one costs more in both money and hassle than the marginal extra rent a more aggressive increase might bring in. Delphine mentioned once, in passing, that she appreciated how straightforward you'd always been about the lease terms, unaware that the actual math behind your restraint was considerably more calculated than simple kindness alone. Currently, the total U.S. stock market has averaged close to 10% a year over long stretches, and a Roth IRA started at 26 with steadily increasing contributions. Left alone through every market cycle without panic selling during the bad years is exactly the kind of unglamorous textbook trajectory that produces a 7-figure account by someone's early 50s, not because of any special financial talent, but because of 25 years of a habit that never once required more discipline than remembering not to touch it. Wade's third leased car came around year 15, a genuinely nice SUV this time, and he mentioned at lunch, half joking, that he sometimes wondered if he was doing life wrong compared to you, still driving the same beat-up Accord all these years later. You told him, honestly, that you didn't think either of you was doing anything wrong. You were just running different equations, and his equation was pointed at something visible, while yours was pointed at something that generated the next dollar without needing anyone to see it. You understood the pull completely, because you'd felt an early version of it yourself, back in your 20s, wanting exactly the kind of car Wade always seemed to have. What changed wasn't the desire so much as the specific decision, made once at 34 and never really revisited, that the desire wasn't worth what it would cost against everything else the same money could quietly become instead. You remember, in fact, sitting in a different dealership at 28, seriously considering a lease on something nicer, and walking out after running rough numbers on a napkin that made the decision obvious enough that you never seriously reconsidered it again. At a clinic holiday party a few years back, a newer therapist who didn't know your history yet asked what kind of car you drove, mostly out of small talk, and you mentioned the Accord plainly. She nodded, polite but visibly unimpressed, and turned back toward Wade, who was describing his SUV's towing capacity to someone else. You got a drink, talked to the two coworkers you'd actually come to see, and left early. On the way out, you noticed Wade's SUV in the lot had a maintenance-required light glowing through the windshield. 3,000 miles overdue by the sticker in the corner. Being quietly underestimated in that parking lot cost you nothing. It's the exact condition under which nobody watches what you do next, which means you get to keep doing it. Wade, for what it's worth, is a genuinely kind coworker and a good physical therapist, well liked by patients and staff alike. This was never a story about him doing anything wrong. It's just an illustration of two people starting at the same salary, in the same building, running two completely different equations for 25 years running. Your sister Naomi called you 11 months ago on a Sunday night, and you could tell within the first 10 seconds this wasn't a normal call. Her small bakery, 4 years into a genuinely good local following, was 3 months behind on rent after a slow winter, and the landlord was threatening to end the lease within 30 days unless she caught up. She had no idea about your accounts. She was just calling her older sibling, the way she always had, hoping for advice or maybe a modest loan to bridge the gap. You could have solved it before she finished the sentence. $22,000 against $2.1 million wasn't a decision in any meaningful sense. It barely registered. You didn't send it immediately. You sat with the phone against your ear, feeling the specific complicated weight of knowing exactly what you could do and choosing, deliberately, not to do it that way. You asked if you could come by the following Saturday and look at her books together, which surprised her, since you'd never once shown interest in the bakery's finances before, always assuming, reasonably, that the numbers side of her business was hers to manage alone. That Saturday turned into 4, spread across a month. You found that her lease had an escalation clause she'd never fully understood at signing, one that had quietly inflated her rent well past her original budget over 2 years. You helped her find a small business relief program specific to food service businesses in her county that neither of you knew existed 3 hours earlier. The second Saturday was the hardest one, going through her supplier invoices line by line and finding she was paying a flour distributor nearly 25% above what a comparable bakery 2 towns over was paying, a detail she'd never noticed because nobody had ever sat down and actually compared the numbers with her before. By the 4th Saturday, she'd renegotiated her lease terms using a notice provision buried in the original contract, secured a modest bridge loan through the relief program, and cut her supplier costs by renegotiating with the flour distributor she'd been overpaying for years without noticing. She never needed the $22,000. She called you the night the new lease terms were signed, crying a little, the way people do when something they built with their own hands actually survives. You never told her what you could have written the check for. You still haven't told her about the accounts at all, though you suspect someday you probably should. Naomi's Bakery has added a second part-time employee since, steady enough now that she's finally taking a real weekend off most months, instead of working through every single one. She still doesn't know the actual scale of what you could have done that Sunday night with a single phone call to a bank. What she knows is that you showed up 4 Saturdays in a row with a legal pad and real attention, which turned out to matter more than a check ever could have. The same lesson you suspect will keep repeating itself in your family for as long as anyone needs it. The email arrived on an ordinary Wednesday, subject line Q3 Consolidated Statement, the same flat, unexciting subject line your financial advisor Ines Whitfield has used for the 11 years she's managed a small piece of your portfolio. You almost let it sit unread until the weekend, the way you usually do, but something made you open it standing in your kitchen, with a mug of coffee going lukewarm in your hand, morning light coming through the same window it always does at that hour. Combined across the retirement accounts, the taxable brokerage account, and the duplex equity, your net worth had crossed $2.1 million. You read the number twice, the way you read something you're not sure you've read correctly, then a third time just to be sure the different account totals had actually added up the way the statement claimed. You didn't call anyone. You didn't take a screenshot. You finished your coffee, drove to the clinic, and spent the day exactly the way you'd spent every other Wednesday for the past 25 years, working with patients on shoulder mobility and grip strength. Nothing about the day announcing that anything had changed. You mentioned the milestone to Ines at your next scheduled call, mostly because she'd asked how you were feeling about the portfolio in general. She wasn't surprised. She mentioned, in the same flat tone she uses for everything, that the trajectory had been visible in your account for at least 3 years. The crossover point where the market's own returns started outpacing your monthly contributions. The exact quiet mechanism that turns a 25-year habit into a number that eventually looks less like effort and more like momentum. She pulled up a simple chart during that same call, the balance over time next to your own contributions over time, and pointed out where the two lines had quietly diverged, years before you'd have noticed it yourself, just checking a single monthly statement at a time. You asked her, half out of curiosity, what she thought the number would look like in another 10 years if nothing changed about your current habits. She ran a rough projection on the spot, conservative assumptions built in. And the figure that came back made you sit back in your chair for a second, not from disbelief exactly, just the same quiet recalibration you'd felt the first time the account crossed $100,000 all those years earlier. You mentioned to Ines, almost as an afterthought, that you didn't feel any different than you had the day before the statement arrived. She said that was the most common reaction she saw across every client who'd ever crossed a significant threshold. Regardless of the specific number involved, the day itself never feels like anything, and it's only weeks or months later, looking back, that people start noticing the specific texture of decisions that would have gone differently at an earlier stage of the same account. You thought about Naomi's bakery call, still fresh in memory from a few months earlier, and realized Ines was probably right. The Accord isn't a costume, and it isn't false modesty either. It's the same practical, unremarkable choice it's always been. And the fact that it now sits parked outside a life worth over $2 million doesn't make it any less genuinely yours. What's changed is your understanding of what the invisibility actually protects. Wade still doesn't know the real number. Naomi still doesn't know. The younger therapist from the holiday party has probably long since stopped thinking about the car at all. Gus, your mechanic, is one of the very few people who's ever come close to understanding the actual math. Mostly because he's watched you maintain the same car for over a decade instead of trading it in. And he mentioned once, half joking, that you must be one of those secret millionaires he's heard about. You laughed and didn't correct him, not because you were hiding anything specifically from Gus, but because there was no version of that conversation that would have changed anything about either of your lives for the better. Gus has been doing your oil changes since before the first $100,000 ever showed up in your Roth IRA. Back when a $43 charge actually required some thought about timing against your paycheck. And there's something you genuinely value about a relationship that's never once required updating along the way. You've thought, more than once, about what it would actually cost to tell people the real number. Wade, Naomi, the coworkers who've quietly pitied your car for over a decade now. The honest answer is that it would cost you very little in any practical sense, and yet you've never done it. Milestone after milestone. Part of it is what happened with Naomi's bakery. The specific proof that visibility changes the shape of even the closest relationships the moment a number becomes real to someone. Part of it is simpler. Nobody in your life has ever once treated you like a project to worry about beyond the occasional comment about the car, and you suspect that dynamic would shift the moment any of them understood the actual scale of what you've built. Currently, financial researchers who study high net worth individuals consistently find that a meaningful share of American millionaires drive cars that are, on average, several years old, purchased, used, and kept well past the point most people would trade them in. Not because these millionaires can't afford something newer, but because the same discipline that built the number in the first place tends to show up in every other financial decision too, including the ordinary ones nobody else is watching. You are, in this specific and unglamorous way, a walking version of that statistic, sitting in a cracked vinyl chair at Gus's shop in a car nobody in your life will ever connect to the number quietly sitting in Ines's spreadsheet. You're back in Gus's waiting room a few months later, another routine oil change. The same cracked vinyl chair, the same faint smell of motor oil and coffee from the machine in the corner, the same muted talk show playing to nobody in particular. A different stranger this time glances at the Accord through the window and asks if you're thinking about upgrading anytime soon. You smile and say maybe someday, the exact same answer you've given for over a decade now, and mean it exactly as little as you always have. 25 years ago, you opened a Roth IRA with $50 and felt something you couldn't quite name. Not pride exactly, not excitement exactly, something quieter than both. Sitting in this waiting room now with a net worth past $2 million and a car that's earned every one of its 187,000 miles, you feel the same thing. Not more, not less. The same feeling, just with more zeros behind it, which tells you something worth sitting with. It was never about the car, or the number, or what either one looked like to anyone in a waiting room. It was about the freedom the number quietly makes available, whether or not a single other person ever finds out it's there. You think about Wade's fourth car, whichever one it is by now, and about Naomi's bakery, steadier these days than it's been in years, and about the younger therapist from the holiday party who's probably forgotten the Accord conversation ever happened at all. None of them think about you the way you sometimes think about all of this, late at night, running the numbers Ines projected out another decade. That asymmetry doesn't bother you the way it might have bothered you once. If anything, it's become its own kind of quiet comfort. Proof that the life you're actually living and the life people assume you're living can simply coexist, without either one needing to correct the other. Gus finishes the oil change and hands you the keys with the same brief nod he always gives, no different than the 1,000 other times he's done exactly this. You pay the same $43, thank him, and drive the Accord home the long way, windows down, radio on, in absolutely no hurry to be anywhere else. What would it look like to build that same quiet freedom in your own life, starting wherever you actually are right now? Not with $2 million, but with whatever your own first ordinary decision about money actually is.